I'm trying to hold still.
Bigfoot took me into the Appalachian Mountains while I was working as a wildlife biologist, and I haven't been the same person since. What I saw after he took me will forever be imprinted on my brain, and I've told nobody about what he truly did to me in those mountains until now. My name is Alara Kestrel. I went into those mountains on contract work, bear migration tracking through one of the most isolated wildlife corridors in the region. I'd done field work like it dozens of times before. Weeks alone in remote terrain, no cell service, no trails, nothing between me and the forest except my equipment and whatever I'd managed to carry in. My last contact with anyone came on a Wednesday evening. I called my field coordinator from the ridge, where I still had signal, and told her I'd found something unexpected in my study area, something I couldn't identify. It had been disturbing my equipment, and I was going to push further in to investigate. I'd be in touch in a few days. She told me to be careful. I told her I always was. I was gone for 21 days. I found out later what those weeks looked like from the outside. Search teams working every grid I'd mapped, using every note I'd left, every landmark I'd recorded, and finding nothing. By day 18, they had begun drafting the notification to my emergency contacts. The search hadn't officially been called off, but everyone involved knew what that kind of silence meant. It all started with my equipment. I'd placed camera traps and data loggers across the valley in positions I'd used before in similar terrain. Good placements, stable ground, concealed well enough that passing wildlife wouldn't disturb them. On the third morning, I went to check a unit and stopped dead on the trail. It had been disassembled, not damaged, not knocked over or chewed or dragged, disassembled. The casing was open. The components had been removed and laid out on a flat rock beside it: battery pack, circuit board, lens, assembly, each piece separated and placed with a precision that made my stomach drop. Before my brain had finished processing what I was looking at, I crouched and stared. I went through everything I knew. Bears destroy cameras. Raccoons scatter things. Nothing in the animal kingdom takes electronics apart and arranges the pieces in order. Whatever had done this hadn't been confused by my equipment. It had understood it well enough to take it apart without damaging anything. It had wanted to see what was inside. I should have packed out right then. Instead, I pulled out my notebook and started writing. I checked the other units that morning. 2 more had been touched, not disassembled like the first, but moved, repositioned, angled differently than I'd left them, as though something had examined each one, decided it wasn't interesting enough to take apart, and set it back down, facing a slightly different direction. I stood in front of the second unit for a long time, trying to decide if I was reading that correctly. I was. I knew I was. I wrote it down, and I kept going. I went deeper the next morning, packed for 2 days, marked my GPS position, and moved into terrain with no trails and no recent sign of human presence. Old-growth forest, the kind that's been left alone long enough to stop feeling like a place people were ever meant to be. The trees were enormous. The canopy was so thick that light came through in thin columns, and the silence had a weight to it I hadn't felt before in any wilderness I'd worked. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something very large, very close, holding, very still. By the second day, I started noticing things I had to slow down to name. The forest felt shaped. I know how that sounds. But I've spent 20 years reading landscape, and I know the difference between what erosion does and what intention does, and what I was walking through had been touched by intention. Trees positioned to form natural corridors through the undergrowth. Brush cleared along specific routes in patterns that had nothing to do with wind or water. Rocks moved, not randomly but consistently, in ways that marked the edges of paths no human had ever made. I kept stopping and turning slowly and trying to find the natural explanation. I kept not finding one. I understood somewhere around mid-afternoon that I was inside someone's territory, that it had been maintained carefully and over a very long time by something that was not human and not any animal I had been trained to account for. I understood that, and I kept walking forward anyway. That was the last rational decision I made for a while. That night, something circled my camp. I heard it first, footsteps too heavy and too deliberate for anything I could name, moving through the trees just outside the reach of my headlamp. Not crashing, not the careless noise of a bear moving through brush. Measured, placed, close enough that I could track the spacing between each step, and the spacing was enormous, and the weight behind each one pressed into the forest floor in a way I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. I lay in my sleeping bag with my knife in my hand and my headlamp off, and I did not move. It circled for hours. It didn't stop, didn't come closer, didn't withdraw, just kept the same fixed distance, patient and slow, until sometime well past midnight when the sound finally went quiet. I didn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, running through every animal I'd ever worked near: black bear, mountain lion, elk, moose, wild boar. I went through all of them, and none of them fit. The stride length was wrong for anything I could name. The weight was wrong. The patience was wrong. Animals circle when they're nervous or territorial, and then they stop. Whatever was outside my tent wasn't nervous. It wasn't displaying territory. It was doing something I didn't have a word for, with a consistency that felt less like instinct and more like purpose. I held my knife and I stared at the roof of my tent, and I waited for morning. The creature appeared at the edge of my camp the following morning. I was crouched at the camp stove when I looked up, and it was simply there, standing between two trees watching me. No approach I'd heard, no sound at all. One moment it wasn't there, and the next it was, and I scrambled backward before I could think and hit the back of my pack and stopped with nowhere else to go. It was over 9 feet tall, dark hair, almost black, covering most of its body, a face with proportions I recognized as roughly primate and couldn't place further than that, eyes that were too still and too fixed and too aware. It didn't move. It stood at the edge of the clearing, and it looked at me the way you look at something you have already spent a long time thinking about. Then, without breaking eye contact, it lowered itself slowly into a crouch. There's more to this case than what you're hearing right now. While researching Elira's story, we found footage, documents, records that had been scrubbed from everywhere else, things that never got a proper explanation. If you want to see them for yourself, they're all in the first link in the description. I did not take that as friendly. I took it as something demonstrating, very deliberately, that it knew exactly how large it was. My heart was going at a rate that made it hard to form thoughts. I had my knife, but I kept both hands visible because everything in me said that reaching for anything would be the last thing I did. I held still. I breathed. The creature watched me with a focus that felt nothing like the attention of an animal. Then it stood, turned, and walked into the trees, slowly, without any hurry at all. The forest took it, and the clearing was empty, and I sat there on the ground for a long time with my hands braced behind me, waiting for my breathing to come back down. I broke camp within the hour and followed it. Part of it was professional. I was a wildlife biologist who had just made contact with something without a scientific name, and I was not built to walk away from that. Part of it was something harder to explain. The sense that the decision had already been made somewhere underneath my thinking, and I was only now catching up to it. I've tried to examine that feeling honestly in the time since. I'm still not sure whether I followed it or whether following was simply the only direction available, and I dressed it up as a choice because that was easier to live with. It led me for hours through old growth I couldn't have navigated alone. Moving slowly enough that I could keep pace, stopping when the terrain slowed me, making sounds at intervals I couldn't parse. Not calls, not warnings, something in a frequency I hadn't heard from any animal before. I marked landmarks and tracked direction changes and tried to build a map in my head. Around hour 3, the map stopped making sense. The terrain folded in ways that shouldn't have been possible given my starting position. By early afternoon, I had no clear read on where I was, which direction I'd come from, or how far I was from anything familiar. I was lost, completely, following something through terrain I couldn't navigate independently, deeper into wilderness where no search team had any reason to look. I thought about my coordinator. I thought about the GPS unit in my pack that was still recording coordinates I'd no longer be able to make sense of. I thought about the fact that I had 4 days of food and no way to know how far I was from the nearest trail. I kept going. The creature brought me to a valley I hadn't been able to see from any of the ridgelines above, a wide clearing ringed by rock formations that rose on all sides like walls. Fire rings with ash that wasn't old. Pathways worn into the earth by years of the same roots traveled over and over until the ground remembered them. Stone arrangements along the clearing's edges that had no natural explanation and no human comparison I could reach for. I stood at the tree line and took it all in. I stood at the tree line and took it all in and couldn't move for a while. The creature walked to the center, made a long, slow sound that seemed to go on longer than its lungs should have allowed, then settled at the far edge with its back against the rock and its eyes on me. I set up camp at the clearing's edge because every other option felt worse. The days that followed were the hardest to reconstruct because I was not in a clear-headed state for most of them. I was frightened in a way that didn't spike and release the way fear is supposed to. It settled in and stayed, low and constant, like a frequency just below hearing that I felt in my back teeth. I slept in pieces. I ate less than I should have. I kept detailed notes because it was the only thing that felt like control, the only way I could remind myself that I was still a person with a methodology and a purpose rather than something that had simply been collected and put somewhere. The creature appeared every day, a little closer each time, not rushing, not announcing what it was doing, just arriving each morning at a distance slightly shorter than the one before. I tracked it in my field journal with the same precision I'd use for any study subject. Day 3, approximately 60 feet. Day 4, maybe 50. Day 5, 30 at most. Close enough that I could hear the specific sound its weight made when it shifted from one foot to the other. A low creak like a very large tree in wind. My field journal entry that day is 2 lines. Closer again. I can hear it breathing. The circling never stopped. Every night, the same measured weight moving at the same distance around my tent for hours in the dark. By the end of the first week, I could track it by sound alone, knew when it sped up, when it slowed, could tell roughly where it was in its circuit by the quality of silence between steps. Some nights, it would pause on the far side of the clearing for long stretches, and the pausing was worse than the movement, because at least when it moved, I knew where it was. When it stopped, I lay there and waited and didn't know anything. I started leaving my headlamp on inside the tent, not because the light helped, because I couldn't stand the dark. On day 7, it left a bundle of stripped branches at the edge of my camp, arranged too deliberately to be anything other than intentional. I found it when I came back from the creek. I stood looking at it for a long time before I touched it. I didn't know what it meant, an offering, a warning, a marker. I had no framework that fit, and I knew forcing one would only mislead me. I moved it to the edge of my tent and kept going. The food situation became serious around day 9. I'd packed for 2 days and had been rationing carefully, but carefully only goes so far. I found a creek I could filter from, and I was competent enough in the field to supplement what I had. But I was burning more calories than I was taking in, and I could feel it. The particular hollowness of a body starting to run a deficit it can't recover from quickly. I wrote in my journal, getting thin, need to find more, and then below that, after a gap, still here. Then, on day 11, the creature charged me. I don't know what triggered it. I had been moving around camp normally, doing nothing I hadn't done on any previous day, when I heard a sound I hadn't heard before. Massive, low, and building fast, like a pressure change before something breaks. And when I turned, it was moving at me from across the clearing at a speed that made no sense for its size. The distance collapsed in under 2 seconds. I had time to register what was happening, and almost nothing else. I didn't run. Running was already over as a concept. I dropped straight to the ground, face down, arms over my head, and pressed myself into the earth and held every signal I'd ever learned for submission all at once. And I held them as hard as I could, and I waited. The sound kept building. What came next was the longest stretch of time I have ever lived through. I was face down in the dirt of that clearing, with the sound filling everything around me, and I was completely certain, with a calm that comes only when there's nothing left to decide, that I was going to die there, that no one would find me, that my coordinator would finish drafting that notification and send it, that the trail would stay cold forever, and whatever remained of me would become part of the forest floor, and the forest would close up over the top the same way it had when I walked in. I had no move left, and I knew it, and I lay there and I waited. The sound peaked, then it stopped completely, instantly, the way a held breath releases, and the silence that followed was so absolute I could hear my own pulse. Then, slowly and terribly, it began to pull back. I stayed on the ground long after the footsteps withdrew, long after the clearing went quiet. When I finally pushed myself up, my arms were shaking in a way I couldn't stop. I looked at my hands for a while. Then I opened my field journal and wrote the date and the time and what had happened, word by word, until the handwriting steadied. That night I lay in my tent and understood clearly, for the first time without any softening around the edges, that I had never been in control of a single moment since I'd walked into that clearing. Not one. Whatever terms I was surviving on, I hadn't set them, and I couldn't renegotiate them, and I didn't know what would cause them to change. I lay there listening to the circling startup again outside the tent. Same distance, same pace, same patience. And I thought about my coordinator, and I thought, she's not wrong to draft that notification. She's not wrong at all. On day 14, it left a stone at the edge of my camp. Smooth, dark, heavier than it looked. I picked it up and held it and set it down where I could see it from anywhere in camp. Moving it felt like something I shouldn't risk. That night, the circling stopped earlier than it ever had. I lay awake waiting for it to resume, and it didn't. And the silence where the sound usually lived was its own kind of pressure, and I didn't sleep anyway. By day 16, I had tried to navigate out 3 times. Each attempt pushed in a different direction. During the hours the creature was absent. Each time the terrain folded back on itself in the same way it had on the first day, and each time I came back to the clearing's edge without being able to explain how. The third time I sat down on a log at the tree line and didn't move for a long time. I tried to think clearly about my options. I wrote them out in the journal. Wait, try again, try a different direction, follow the creek further. Then I sat there looking at the list, knowing none of them felt like they would work because none of them had worked. And I didn't know why, and not knowing why was the part I couldn't get past. I wrote, I don't know if I'm being kept here or if I'm just lost. I don't know if there's a difference anymore. I looked at that for a while before I closed the notebook. On day 18, I woke up and the stone had been moved. It was in the center of the clearing, placed on a flat rock, positioned to face my tent. I stood in the tent door and looked at it across the open ground and didn't go near it for most of the day. Toward evening, I walked to it and stood over it and looked at it up close. It was the same stone. It hadn't been replaced. Something had come into my camp while I slept, picked it up, carried it to the center of the clearing, and placed it there with intention. I walked back to my tent and sat inside with the door zipped and didn't write anything that night. On the 19th day, the creature didn't come. The clearing without it was not a relief. Without the thing I'd been afraid of for 19 days, was more frightened, because the absence meant something had shifted, and I had no way to know what. I sat with my back against the rock wall and watched the tree line for most of the day, and the waiting had its own particular weight, different from all the others I'd been carrying and not lighter than any of them. It came back at dusk. The sounds it made were different from anything across the previous 19 days. Longer. Slower. I'd filled 6 field notebooks by then, recorded every vocalization I could, built as close to a catalog as I could manage. None of it prepared me for what it made that evening, something that seemed to come from beneath language and beneath instinct both, from somewhere older than either. It didn't carry threat. It carried finality, the specific quality of something that has reached its natural end and is not asking for an opinion about it. The creature walked to the clearing's edge and stopped. It turned and looked at me one last time. Then it stepped to the side, an opening in the tree line, held open, waiting. I packed my things. I picked up the stone from the flat rock where it had been placed and held it for a moment, and then set it back down at the clearing's edge, because taking it felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain and didn't try to. I shouldered my pack and walked to the opening and went through it without looking back. I followed a creek downstream for hours until the forest thinned and sounds from another world came through. Distant voices, an engine, the smell of someone else's fire. I built my own and sat beside it and waited. Sometime after dark, a searcher pushed through the brush at the clearing's edge and stopped when his light found me. He looked at me the way people look at something they had quietly stopped expecting to find. I told him I was going to explain what had happened before he moved me, and that it wasn't going to fit inside anything he'd been trained with, and that I needed him to listen. Anyway, he looked at me the way people look at someone whose time out there has cost them something permanent. I answered every question he had with the same precision I'd used my whole career. And then, before we reached the tree line, I said it plainly. Bigfoot had led me into those mountains, held me there for 21 days, and let me go on terms I still don't understand.